conference is brought to you by Indic Researchers Forum. Indic Researchers Forum is a think tank that aims at bringing out quality research on geopolitics, national security, and international relations through a civilizational perspective. This conference has been organized in light of the ongoing Russia-Ukraine war. The gravity of the issue is that it is no longer considered as just a conflict, but a war. The level of destruction is immense, especially when it comes to Ukraine, and so is the case with Russia. India has abstained from the creation of a resolution to address the Ukraine issue, and Russia had appreciated this stance, while the US has not taken this in a positive light, rather imposed sanctions on Russia. India has focused on encouraging the de-escalation of war and the application of diplomatic means of communication to solve the crisis at hand. It surely expresses its regret about the situation and is ready to aid in whatever manner it can to restore peace. Our immensely experienced panelists are here to enlighten us with different perspectives on the Russia-Ukraine war issue. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our session chair for the inaugural session, Dr. Nand Kishor MS. Dr. Kishor is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science and International Studies in Pondicherry University. So has been awarded the Erasmus Fellowship by the European Union. He was also the recipient of a short-term junior research fellowship from UNHCR, Brookings, Government of Finland. Currently, he is also Senior Research Fellow at Defense Research and Studies in India, an analyst at Islamic Theology of Counterterrorism in London, and a visiting fellow to AIDA in Kathmandu. To give the keynote address, we have amongst us Commodore R.S. Vasan and Lieutenant General Shokin Chauhan. And for the chief guest address, we have Shri Madhav with us. I now welcome Kishor sir to enlighten us with his perspective on the issue at hand and take over the session proceedings from here. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you, Shri. Thanks for the kind introduction. A very good evening to each one of you gathered here. I think it's a very apt occasion that we have all come in, and my special congratulations to the Indic Research Forum and all of you who have taken part and taken initiative to do something like this. I think it's very important that a number of institutions are discussing, educating. A lot of good things are happening with regard to the ongoing war in Ukraine, and I think we have seen so many dimensions of it, and every day there's a new dimension coming in, and then we see so many geopolitical ramifications, geopolitical outcomes. At the same time, it's so curious to see that in the 21st century, something like this is happening, and then the world powers are numb. Nobody is able to respond to anything. At the same time, there is this rise of Russia that has come back to the discussion after the end of Cold War. We thought probably Russia would not rise to this level, but it has come back. And it has also got a different perspective altogether. We have seen a number of countries siding towards Ukraine, and there are others who also say there is this perennial interest, that is national interest of Russia is in trouble, and due to which any country in that situation would do. The United States has done in the past, and the United States continues to do that even today. But two wrongs don't make one right. But at the same time, there are so many different ways of looking at this particular problem. There are short-term, there are immediate, short-term, medium-term, and long-term geopolitical ramifications that are associated here. And to discuss this, I shouldn't be taking much time. I have a galaxy of speakers with me, and most of them have been such decorated personalities, and I have the pleasure to introduce them at this juncture. At the first, I would want to introduce Commodore R.S. Vasan. He is the Director General of the Chennai Center for China Studies. He is presently the Director General of the Chennai Center for China Studies, Regional Director of the National Maritime Foundation, Chennai Chapter, and Head Strategy and Security Studies at the Center for Asia Studies. An alumnus of the Defense Service Staff College, the Naval War College, and the International Visitor Leadership Program, Commodore Sheshadri Vasan has a distinguished service of over 34 years in the Navy and the Coast Guard. His appointments include command of warships, 2 major air stations, and a maritime air squadron. He has participated in both 1971 war and IPKF operations. He was an instructor at the Naval War College, India. Prior to retirement, he was the regional commander of the Indian Coast Guard region East overseeing the EEZ patrol, SAR, anti-piracy, fisheries protection, maritime border control, marine pollution prevention, and other maritime tasks in the Bay of Bengal. Post-retirement, he has served in many think tanks and is a regular speaker at many international and national conferences. More than anything, he has been a guiding force to many of us. We look up him on a daily basis. We have been sending students to intern there, and more than any of these decorations, as a person from the forces, is a great human being that at least I have experienced for the last 10 years. I can tell with that much of command and at least confidence that he is someone who delivers stuff, and he is someone who speaks sense in most of the cases that I've been part of. So it's my pleasure to have you here, sir, and over to you, Commodore Vasan.
Thank you, Dr. Nanda Kishor. It's always a pleasure to meet up with you and all these wonderful panelists that you have put together today. It's a great initiative in my assessment. It's not that there's any dearth of opinion on what is happening. There are opinions, counter opinions, and different strokes of what is going to happen in terms of the impact that it has on the global order and in terms of how India needs to respond to this. So let me acknowledge the presence of all the senior veterans who are here, Ram Madhav ji and others. And I also would like to thank Commodore Deshmukh for facilitating this process. Commodore Deshmukh has joined C3S and he's also been very active in all this. And to his credit, he's already published 3 or 4 documents with C3S of great relevance, including on China. So I look forward to, of course, learning from everybody. If you see the name of Mangala Vasan against my place, it is my wife's name. And we are in Rajali where the connection was not good, so I've taken her permission to use her name. So otherwise, everything is under control. So, to look at this, every day there is some development. Even 2 hours ago, there were developments of great significance. The major thing that everybody is worried about is the kind of impact that economic sanctions would have on Russia, on one hand, and the counter responses that Russia initiates on the rest of the world. There have also been selective sanctions that have been imposed on some banking, but they have let the famous Gazprom bank, which deals with gas supply to Europe. So obviously, energy is an important factor that will drive these sanctions narrative in the coming months. So obviously, there is a theory that tells you that from 2014 onwards, Russia prepared for something like this. Because, after the annexation of Crimea, so they knew that as and when they would like to prevent the NATO's positioning in East Europe, they would need to prepare for an active, assertive action such as the one which was demonstrated on 24th February. So apparently the linkages to the global economy, the increasing of their gold stock, the trying to move away from the dollar are all important dimensions of how Russia wants to stem this impact of sanction. It's not that Russia will not be affected, but in a globalized economy, every nation would be equally affected. It is reflected on a daily basis in the stock markets that you see, the kind of fluctuations that are taking place. Now, just a few points of importance as to why Russia has done it, why now, and why is that there has been hardly any response from the so-called NATO, which had promised all the support to Ukraine. So this is where one will have to go back to the history. I will not go very much deep into history, but the point is that Ukraine was always something that Russia wanted to ensure that did not fall in the lap of NATO. Because that would have meant that the change of the geographical strategy, that was more of a status quo position where NATO forces were not deployed in Ukraine. But the moment there was this threat of Ukraine leading to a certain amount of pressure for joining the NATO, because after all, even today, Ukraine wants to join the NATO, but it's obviously the calculations have indicated to ESO and its allies that it may not be a wise move. So there are official agreements to say that they will not expand the borders in Eastern Europe beyond a particular point. But this is what was violated. And also, there are also some disturbing reports of the location of chemical laboratories, biolabs, which were apparently in Ukraine. No, there were some reports which have been removed from the internet. Whether it is true or not true, time only will tell us. But one has to be very careful when we are analyzing these reports because there is informatization warfare afoot, which is very evident. That is another dimension of this war, which is so very evident that every day you have a narrative, a counter narrative, a false narrative, a manipulation of media information, and also a lot of morphing that takes place. And many videos which are from Syria, from Libya, and others are shown as if they are from this war. So, this is something, of course, which needs to be analyzed. So, any report that comes your way, unless it's from a radical, credible, source, we need to take it with a pinch of salt. Now, what is a credible source? Because everybody is an interested party. Even the Western press, whether it's the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, they have their agenda. It synchronizes with the policymakers there. So, it's not that just because it comes from NYT or WSJ, everything is fine, or just it comes from RT, it is false. So I think we need to be able to look at the entire scenario and look at the scenario that's unfolding in terms of how a modern hybrid warfare is being fought. So there are these dimensions of hybrid warfare. There are lessons for India in terms of what we can learn in terms of this. There is another other analysis which all of us, I'm sure, agree with, which is that Ukraine, at the time of dismemberment of the Soviet Union, if it had retained the nuclear warheads on its soil, the guess is that Russia would not have ventured into the Ukraine. So obviously there is this factor of nuclear deterrence. This is a lesson for us. Luckily, we do have our own second strike capability and the strategic forces command, which is ready. So there are many, many lessons for observers in India at the political level, at the diplomatic level. There have also been many questions on India's response to the Russian aggression. There are no doubts it's an aggression. But Russia had to balance its responses to West on one side and Russia on the other side. So, because when you go back in history, it's only Soviet Unionists that stood by us. This is for decades of story where the Soviet India's friendship treaty worked in our favor to liberate Bangladesh. It has also come to our help in the nuclear domain, in space domain, and even today, some 60-70% of our defense hardware is based on that. So therefore, I think India is in a very tricky position in terms of carrying out outright condemnation in the 3-4 meetings that took place. So abstention perhaps was the best course left to us because, after all, you can't condemn anybody and thereafter on the air. And just because you condemn Russia, it was not that Russia was going to stop a war. It has a specific plan. It's working towards that. And we have our own constraints now. We need to be able to balance our relations with US and allies, Europe. And many observers feel that India's abstention amounts to support to Russia. So, this is where there is a tricky portion. I'm sure the diplomats who are going to speak after me will dwell on this issue on what exactly is the diplomatic challenge that we face today and how are we able to overcome this. So far, when you look at the responses by the MEA and by the government of India and their press releases, it's quite clear that I think we walked the tightrope walk has been so far okay, but how long can this go on is something. But we need to prepare for the ill effects of something that will be there as a downstream effect of this war. It's already showing in terms of oil prices, it has shot up to 130 US dollars. The dollar also is likely to use its relevance, which is what Russia and China want. But I'm sure the economists in the group will look at those issues of how the fall of dollar or the rise of the Chinese currency and the gold will all again recalibrate the entire economic scene outside. So there are many dimensions to this, and I'm particularly happy that we have this galaxy of highly experienced speakers who are going to analyze this threadway and tell us what our India's option should be. Whatever else is happening elsewhere, how does it impact the Quad, for example? No, because Quad, every partner has clearly said that it's not a military alliance. It's not like the NATO. They're already looking at blue dot economy. They are looking at blue economy initiatives. They're looking at vaccine diplomacy. They're looking at exchange of technical expertise. So obviously that is something which can go on its own. And in any case, we all know internally that it is definitely something as a countervailing architecture in the Indo-Pacific. So that will continue to be nurtured. So, but this would now face greater challenges in the kind of stiff opposition to India's abstention. Even UAE, which abstained along with us in the next round, did something which we did not expect. So there is a continuous change in the global strategy and our diplomatic initiatives that are there, and they will be stressed to their limits. And luckily, we have a very strong government in the center, and our own assertions by the External Affairs Minister have been very reassuring. In fact, I think he's spared no efforts in explaining our stand very clearly to all the global leaders, whether it is France or Germany or USA or wherever. So, and also the other point, which at least in the public domain, everybody tries to tell you that Ukraine has never supported, and therefore, should we go around supporting Ukraine today? So these are questions that need to be answered. Now, as a military man, I also would like to look at the military impact that's likely to be there on Indian acquisitions. The Indian Navy itself was getting a lot of gas turbines from Ukraine. We also have many of the food supplies which was coming from Ukraine, because there's a only fertile area in Europe. I mean, the best place for soya beans and sunflower oil, etc., etc. So, as far as the how do we now protect ourselves against the kind of delays that are inevitable today in terms of warship supplies? Some of our warships which are being constructed in Russia would face a delay because of this turmoil, and also reprioritization of the supply chain. The supply chain will be under distress. So this is where we needed to look at what kind of alternatives we have, and it's a tough time to be in for any government and for policymakers in the next 5 years, because there were certain trajectories which appeared to help us in our recovery post-COVID, and also in our strategy to engage with the rest of the world to improve our economic might. Now, we all were looking at $5 trillion by 2025 or whatever. So all this will now come under a lot of strain. So the future is, I won't use the word bleak, but I would use the word, it's very, very stressful and challenging for all of us, whether you're in the military, whether you're on the civil streets, whether you're a banker, or whether you are somebody. I think I must also know that, that India had sufficient clout to ensure that our evacuation under Operation Ganga, I understand General Chauhan is likely to talk about it, is something that, it has is given a lot of hope to the citizens of this country, to say that the safety and security of our citizens has not been abandoned. And, they have moved everything to establish safe corridors, to even have the airspace to help us out, to provide medical supplies, to allow them to move to the borders. So, there are many, many lessons in terms of how we have coped with the international situation that has caused a lot of anguish to the entire global order. And, it is for us, with the help of researchers who are here today, to look at where we stand in terms of the impact that has been caused because of this Russian aggression against Ukraine. We don't have to keep on going back to the history to say, what happened in the past. So we need to deal with the present and also try and protect our future. So this is where I would like to stop here. I know there are plenty of speakers after me, so I would not like to take away all the time for myself. And also I'm right now in Arakodam, where the connectivity is not so good. So I may have to leave early, for which I apologize to all the panel speakers, but I'll definitely look at the recordings later and revert to you should there be something else. I would like to wish the Indic researchers all the very best in trying to learn the best from the experts who are here today. And I have no doubts whatsoever that together we'll be able to arrive at the takeaways from this discussion, and also ensure that there are key points on which we need to act immediately at different levels, at the government level, at the individual level, at the NGO level, and at the academic level. So there is phenomenal things that are required to be done. There are many areas, so all that obviously cannot be covered in 15 minutes that was allotted to me. But together, I'm sure that at the end of this, I know each speaker would have brought out the total dimensions of what we need to contend with, and what are the way ahead options for us who will be seriously affected. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity, and all the very best. I'll continue to be here as long as the internet holds, and thereafter I'll have to leave with due apologies to all the wonderful panelists who are here. Thank you. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Commodore Vasan. I think that was an excellent sum up of very, very pertinent issues that are going to be haunting the world order itself. Along with that, there were problems, and there were also the ray of hope in terms of the way India conducted itself, and also the options that it has kept open for itself. Being a good student of history, this is what I can say. What has come out very strongly as part of the outcome of this particular fiasco is also that India has been very cautious. India has been a good student of history, and India has made its option very, very clear. I think that was very, very clear in your presentation itself. Thank you so much. We move on to the next presentation. That's by Lieutenant General Shokin Chauhan, PVSM, AVSM, YSM, SM, and VSM. So it's also a PhD. It's my honor to introduce Lieutenant General Shokin Chauhan. He was the chairman of the Ceasefire Monitoring Group in August 2018. He was the Director General of Assam Rifles, India's oldest and largest paramilitary force. He has held several key appointments during his long career in the army. He has served at the apex level in the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Home Insurgency, Counter-Terrorism, Border Guarding, and Human Resource Management. He also has vast experience in military diplomacy since he was the defense attaché in the Indian Embassy in Nepal for 3.5 years. That's between 2004 and 7. Apart from this one, the type of insights that he brings in are phenomenally great. And it's indeed our pleasure to have Lieutenant General Shokin Chauhan. Sir, over to you. You can speak till 4:45, and at 4:40 we will have Ram Madhavji joining, and he will begin at 4:45. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you, Commodore Vasan, for the initial keynote address. I have been speaking on the Russian-Ukraine war over the last 2 weeks. That's ever since it began. And a couple of things that I've noticed, and I feel that it's essential for us to understand, is firstly a little bit of a history. We cannot understand the present. We cannot deal with the future unless we understand the past. Well, Russia began this invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. That's about roughly 16 days ago. It was a major escalation of the ongoing crisis. It wasn't something that was new. It was an ongoing crisis on the Russian-Ukrainian war that began actually in 2014. And since World War II, this is the largest military action that has taken place in Europe. To understand why Russia has done this, let's go to the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity in February 2014. You're all aware that Russia annexed Crimea, and the Russian-backed separatists also seized a part of southeast Ukraine in Donbass. In 2021, Russians began a large-scale military build-up along its border with Ukraine. They also had a major exercise with Belarus, and therefore built a large force north of Ukraine, that is in the area of Belarus. And this led to an international crisis. And during this time, President Putin espoused Russia's views. He kept on, in many ways, announcing to the world that he would not accept this movement of Ukraine towards NATO. He didn't understand, and he didn't want didn't want NATO to come in. And he also said that if NATO gets nuclear weapons if NATO gets nuclear weapons into Ukraine, then the crisis would be similar to what happened in Cuba in 1962, when the US threatened a nuclear war over the placing of nuclear missiles in Cuba. He also accused, and here is a lot of double-speak, Ukraine of committing genocide against its Russian-speaking population. You're aware that the area of Donbass, in the area of Donetsk, in the area of Luhansk, there are a lot of Russian-speaking people. Almost 40% of the population of these three districts actually have Russians. The background is that when Ukraine was a part of the USSR, there were a large number of Russian workers that were settled in Ukraine, but now have become a largest minority. And if you count both eastern and western Ukraine, eastern western divided between the Dnieper River, you would actually come to know that about 20% of, or 20 to 30% of the population in eastern Ukraine, that is the population that's the area closer to Russia, are Russian speaking or supporters of Russia. And maximum number of Ukraine in the white Ukrainians, as they say, are west of the Dnieper River. So on the next day, that is 24th, the Russian Federation Council unanimously echoed Putin's authorization of military force, and the Russians entered both territories. Putin announced that a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine was going to start. And minutes later, the missiles and airstrikes hit places across the Ukraine, including the capital of Kyiv. Now, what happens? What happens on the other side? Within minutes of Putin's announcements, explosions were reported in Kyiv, in Kharkiv, in Odessa, and the Donbas region. An alleged leaked report of the Russian spy agency, FSB, claims that the agency was not warned about Putin's plan to invade Ukraine. So is it a one-off situation, or is Ukraine playing a game here, or something? These are issues that we must actually analyze as military analysts go. There were multi-pronged assaults that were launched from Russia, Belarus, and the two occupied territories of Ukraine, that is Crimea and Donbass. And four specific war theaters, four specific lines of intrusion or incursion or invasion happened. As you probably be knowing, I commanded the Strike Corps. I commanded India's largest and oldest Strike Corps, Strike 1. And during my time as the GOC of Strike Corps, of the Strike Corps, we had held a large exercise with the Russians, wherein a major general of their motorized brigade had come in at the Thar Desert. And I had the occasion to sit down and talk to him about a lot of issues. And this was in 2016, so not very far back. And what I realized was that the Russians are very clear about how they plan to take out operations like that. Of course, our exercise was to do with counter-terrorism. But even during the time that we were talking about counter-terrorism, the Russian general, I will not take his name, always spoke of using artillery support. And the other thing that you should know, and it's important again for you to understand before you start judging how Russians carry out their operations, is the Russian use of artillery and masked artillery. And the second thing is that their motorized brigades are almost as large as a division, are commanded by a major general, and always carry nuclear weapons with them. So it's necessary for us to keep in mind this particular issue. Now, how far will Russia go? It's already clear that Vladimir Putin has said that he seeks control of Ukraine. He wants to overthrow the government of President Zelensky, who has been democratically elected. But after the revolution that took place in 2014, where a pro-Russian leader and president of Ukraine was removed. And at that time, there are whispers, and now it's well known, that the CIA and the US had helped in the removal of the pro-Russian president of Ukraine. So Russia's stated goal is that Ukraine will be freed from oppression and cleansed of the Nazis, the neo-Nazis. And under this false narrative that Ukraine is being run by fascists since 2014, Mr. Putin has spoken about bringing to court those who committed bloody war crimes against the civilians. He has denied aiming to occupy Ukraine. and he's rejected a UK's accusation before the war that he was plotting to install a pro-Kremlin puppet. But then he had also said that there would be no invasion. So you can't take Ukraine or you can't take Putin at face value. Is there an immediate threat to Russia's Baltic neighbors? There's a lot of talk about the Third World War. There's a lot of talk about NATO entering this war. But NATO can only enter this war, and you must remember that, if Russia was to invade a NATO country. So that, if you keep in mind, and Putin has said this again and again, that there is no immediate threat or no threat at all to the Baltic republics, who are now a part of NATO. But at any rate, even then, NATO has bolstered their defenses just in case. Now, in 2015, President Putin wrote a long piece describing the Russians and Ukrainians as one nation. And he described the collapse of the Soviet Union in December 1991 as the disintegration of historical Russia. Somebody who's worked out of Belarus through a long-time authoritarian leader, Alexander Lukashenko. But in Ukraine, that is quite another matter. So, if there is no problem to the Baltic republics, I don't see World War III happening. I don't see the Baltic republics under attack by Putin. The third issue that I wanted to tell you, and what I feel is important for us as strategic analysts to understand, is the narratives that are now going around this particular war. There is one narrative, that's the Western narrative, the narrative that is being spread by the Western countries. Countries like the US, NATO countries, and Western Europe. They have one narrative that says that Russia is an evil power, that Russia and Putin must be removed, and that Russians are criminals and will face war crimes. That is one narrative. That narrative says that Russia is losing the war. That narrative says that Russians are committing mass-scale abuse of power, of human rights. That narrative also says that Zelensky is winning and that the Ukrainians are putting on a huge, huge fight. There is now the second narrative. That is the narrative of Russia. The Russian narrative is not being heard at all in the world, because the NATO powers have absolutely blanked out Russia today, and the balance of any mass media from Russia outside, Twitter, Facebook, all these mass media applications have stopped functioning in Russia. So we don't know what that narrative is at all. But at the same time, you have to understand that the Russian and the truth, what are the Russian narratives and what is the truth? The power of actors in contemporary conflict is no longer defined just by military equipment, but also by the support of the people at home and the people in the occupied part of Ukraine. Russia has mastered this ability to conduct an information war. But within the area of Ukraine, probably might find the carrying out of this information war very difficult. Throughout this invasion, there is another narrative that comes out. The messages, the videos, the photographs, and the audio recordings of ordinary people using their mobile phones to photograph what is happening inside Ukraine and to beam it across the world. But once again, like that invariable elephant and the blind men of Hindustan, where each one of the people is actually touching only one part of the elephant, we are unable to understand the larger strategic perspective of what actually is happening in this war. Now, that's important for us to understand, because otherwise we cannot be strategic thinkers. We cannot be strategic. We cannot tell you what's going to happen when we simply don't know what's happening inside. And who actually knows what's happening inside? Do the Ukrainians in Kyiv know? Do the Americans know? with their mass media ability. Do the Russians know, but are unable to tell us? So these are issues that when we talk about discussing an ongoing war, these are the casualties of war. The truth is the casualty of war. We get taken in by a particular narrative. We get taken in by the fact that the Russians might be losing. We get taken in by the fact that the Russians haven't planned this particular attack well. We get taken in by the fact that maybe there's going to be a mass-scale insurgency tomorrow in Ukraine. But from my interaction with the Russian army, which has been considerable and at the apex level, all I can say is that I was extremely impressed by the Russian ability to wage war. I was impressed by the professionalism of Russian soldiers. I was impressed by the professionalism of their small team leaders. So we have to be very, very clear when we discuss this as to what part we are actually planning to speak about. And I would request my colleagues who speak after me to keep this particular thing in mind, that when you speak about this war, speak in totality about what's happening and not as the blind men of Hindustan, who simply have no clue what and which part of the narrative we are picking up what. Thank you. I wish this session all success, and we look forward to now Mr. Ram Madhav's lecture and the rest of the session going on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, General Chauhan. I think excellently put. It's nice to hear the other side of the story, as you mentioned, that very few have been able to speak on that front. I also had spoken in one of the forums as well. Without wasting much time, we have amidst us Shri Ram Madhavji, chief guest of this particular event. Let me take the pleasure of introducing him. Shri Ram Madhav is an Indian politician, author, and thinker who is also the former National General Secretary of the Bharatiya Janata Party. He is a member of the Governing Council of India Foundation, a New Delhi-based premier think tank. He also serves as a member of the National Executive of the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak Sangh, RSS. A renowned author and thinker, Shri Madhav has over 200 publications to his credit. He has authored several books in English and Telugu, with the most recent one being the Hindutva Paradigm, Integral Humanism and the Quest for a Non-Western Worldview. Because India comes first, reflections on nationalism, identity and culture, and uneasy neighbors, India and China after 50 years of the war. He is a regular contributor to platforms like the Indian Express, Hindustan Times, and Open Magazine, amongst others. He has been the editor of Bharatiya Prajna, a monthly magazine in English published by Prajna Bharati, and he's also an associated editor of Jagriti, a Telugu weekly. He's been a personality whom people have seen on televisions to most of the places. He's also a prolific orator, a public speaker who can impress any level of audience. So it's our great pleasure to have you, Ram Madhavji. We have shared the platform on several occasions. Once again, it's my pleasure to have you here. Over to you, Ram Madhavji.
Thank you, Dr. Nand Kishor. Let me, at the very outset, say that I'm a war agnostic. I don't believe that there are any just wars in this era, in this age. So I approach this Ukrainian war also from that perspective only. General Saab spoke before me. He placed before you the two versions that we hear often. It is true that there is a sanitized version coming from the West to all of us, but I don't believe that Mr. Putin is so innocent as we want to believe. He is also sanitizing his version. He is also not allowing magazines to write about what is happening inside Russia. So the reality is we do not know which version is actually coming to us and which version is right and which version is not right, which version is complete and which version is not complete. Having said it, it is true that in this war, both sides have their own justifications. The NATO countries believe that Ukraine has a right to choose which side it wants to stay. Russia also, of course, has a right to ensure that its national security is not compromised. Both have presented their logic before the world. They have convinced people on both sides. I come across a number of generals who are very unhappy with the way the Russian army has conducted itself, or Mr. Putin has conducted itself by marching his armies into Ukraine now. Earlier he did it in Crimea, then he did it in two provinces there, and finally he now is trying to take over the entire country. There are many who do not like it. And of course, there are many who sympathize with him, who feel that what he is doing is out of compulsion or out of his nation's security imperatives and all that. We as a country took a neutral stand in this war. We all know that at the United Nations Security Council, on 3 different occasions, we decided to abstain. While abstaining, we made one point very clear, that war is not a solution and the two parties should come together and discuss. Now, as a person who observes international politics, I feel that abstention is not a virtue. It's only a compulsion for countries. What is happening in the present scenario is, two sides are fighting. One side is propped up by the NATO, the other side is led by Putin. There is nobody in the middle to stand up and say that this much is okay, this is not okay. That neutrality, which only leaves countries helpless when a war is raging, is not the kind of neutrality we expect. We need at least some countries who can stand up and say that, okay, there are certain aspects that this side has to correct, and there are other aspects that the other side has to correct. There was a reference to Mr. Putin's that long monologue that he gave about the history. Of course, he gave it in 2015, but he gave it very recently also once again. Now, on the face of it, that narrative looks very attractive, that Ukraine was never a separate nation, etc., etc. But you extend it to other countries. You extend it to your own situation. Can such a historical logic be applied in other countries also, for simply marching armies into neighboring countries? Can we say that because there are people sympathetic to me in Tarai region in Nepal, I simply march our armies into Nepal? So there are many questions that will be thrown up if such a narrative is accepted merely on face value. In a given specific situation, yes, probably Russia is right in its concern about its national security, especially the way the West has demeaned it. They tried to insult, humiliate the Russian leadership. They continuously tried to provoke them right from 2004 onwards. Repeatedly tried to provoke the Ukrainian leadership first, and then tried to take public, as late as at the Munich Security Conference. Look at what Vice President Kamala Harris had to say. When war was raging, a big country like America, in the first place, I would say they should have sent somebody more sensible than Kamala Harris. Somebody who understands international politics, somebody who understands diplomacy. Fair enough, it's their choice. But the Vice President of that great country, US, gives a call to the Ukrainians who are in the midst of a war to come and join NATO. No, this kind of recklessness on the part of the Western powers is something that probably presents Mr. Putin as a victim, as somebody who is at the receiving end of the West. So that foolishness, that provocative behavior is something we all should stand up and condemn. But I would also urge all of us to also sometimes think of principles. You can't simply walk your armies into another country. However much the dislike of you for the political dispensation there, it may be a comedian, it may be somebody you don't like. We have seen many adverse situations in our neighborhood. Our armies have handled them. No general in India said we should simply march our armies into those countries. Why I am saying this is, every country has a right to its security, protecting its self-interests. But there are certain universal, rules, procedures that all of us must follow. Today, what is happening is when two powerful sides are taking two sides, and there is nobody in the middle to tell both of them that no, this is not the way to go about. We are only forced to either abstain or take sides. That is the reality in which we are stuck today. So, probably having taken a compulsive position of abstention and neutrality, for us as India, what is probably more important is to look ahead. What will be the consequences of this kind of a war? This is a war that is bringing back certain historic arguments. We all must be very careful about it. Having accepted nation-state formula, for us a civic world order, a liberal democratic world order, we all must try to uphold it. We have to find ways of addressing the conflicts. Now, let me tell you, Eurasian conflict, the one that is happening in Ukraine today, is not the first conflict that is happening in the last 2 decades. We have had Iraq. We were silent at that time. Then we had, wars happening, internal wars happening in countries like Nigeria. We had no role. We had the Russian army simply walking into Crimea. Nobody had any role to play. You had that Nagorno-Karabakh where 1 million people or maybe 100,000 people died. No stand. And when Ukraine comes, then also there is nobody in the middle to stand up and say that no, this has to stop. Let us look at the consequences of it. This is leading to a situation where a big divide is going to happen between the West and part of Eurasia. I see as a geopolitical battle. Who will control those parts of Eurasia which are generally described as the West? That is Western Europe, largely. And some countries in Eastern Europe, like Poland, Hungary, Lithuania, some of these countries which have decided to join the Western group. Whether they will be under the thumb of the Americans, or the Eurasian unity will bring China, Russia, and all these countries together on one platform as a very big geopolitical, geostrategic entity. That is the real battle going on. As an important country in this region, we cannot escape from the fallout of this conflict. We all hope that the war in Ukraine ends soon. But there are senior generals here, that in Europe, wars have a tendency to extend for years. In fact, the history was that wars started as small wars between two countries and ended up becoming world wars. So the talk about Third World War may sound very premature or very immature today, but looking at Europe's history, we have to keep our fingers crossed. We only hope that this war ends soon. But then the consequences that follow this division that has happened are going to affect the entire world for coming many decades to come. There will be geopolitical consequences. Now, Russia, a weakened Russia probably, Maybe geographically bigger Russia, but militarily, economically weakened Russia will move much closer into the Chinese orbit that everybody knows. I'm not saying anything very unusual. It is bound to happen. The stocks that are plummeting in Russia will be purchased by the Chinese companies. The economy that is sinking in Russia. Now, one may argue that this is all West's propaganda. I don't believe. There are clear signals of the Russian ships getting stuck in many seas and all that. So Russian economy is going to get hit by the sanctions and all, and that again gives an advantage to China. So the consequence will be an Eurasian Union in which China and Russia will come together, and together with countries like Turkey, Pakistan, etc., it certainly emerge as a strong alliance or strong coalition here. And more importantly for us to ponder is both Chinese and Russians are now completely delinking themselves from the Western instruments, Western financial instruments, Western digital instruments, of course, Western military dependence and economic trade dependence. Whether they will be able to do it fully on the last two, I don't know, but on digital and financial instruments, they are very seriously working on developing their own instruments. And, they are going to have their own Googles, their own Microsoft. They are going to have their own SWIFT bank transaction instruments. In fact, the Russian instrument already has 390 subscriber banks from Eurasian region. So they will now try to de-dollarize the economy and trade in our Eurasian region. So that will put a lot of, that will pose a lot of challenge to countries like India. There, I really appreciate our Prime Minister's foresight, the decision. Of course, he's continuous harping on Atmanirbharta, one aspect which is very important for us, and especially after the way the West has behaved by randomly going about imposing sanctions and all. It can be a threat to any country. Tomorrow, if they don't like us, they may put 100 types of sanctions on India. So countries have to now learn to be self-reliant, especially countries of India's size have to become more self-reliant. That's one very important lesson, and we have to work in that direction much more faster. But the very important second point is to encourage this digital currency in India. Very important step, because we are too much dependent on dollar today. I'm not saying it as a criticism. It's a reality. Now, what if tomorrow the kind of trade that you have with Russia, Russia says, no, I don't accept your dollar. What will you do? So there, our effort to go to indigenous digital currency is also a very important step that we have taken, until we rise as a very strong voice, a middle ground we create, where we are in a position to, avert such disasters, where two big forces, each having its own logic, coming and clashing on the world stage, and we are only helpless to walk out and boycott and try to make it a virtue. So until then, India needs to prepare itself, and in that direction, Prime Minister has initiated certain very important reforms. I think for the time being, we need to pursue those reforms much more vigorously, especially the digital currency, and going to conversion of our dollar currency into gold. These kind of measures are also very important for our economy in the immediate short run. In the short run, in the long run, we have to now turn to that Atmanirbharta concept in a big way. Atmanirbharta not at the small level, but at all levels, in our defense establishment, in our economy, in our trade, in our currency, currency management, in all these areas. Atmanirbharta should be the way forward for us. I thought, as a layman, I should only place these facts. I'm not a defense person. So obviously, I will not have those strategic insights that probably eminent generals like General Chauhan and all have. I thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Madhav. As usual, you always come up with a different perspective and a new perspective as well. Always, I think, if not in academic forums and these type of forums, where else we can discuss? Anyway, we are not part of the elite grouping on what is India's national security or anything of that sort. But certainly, these are the voices that have to be heard, and many more people who look up to young scholars, students, and common audience. Many of them would look up to people like you, and I'm sure there are several other dimensions as well that are certainly going to be explored by many scholars who are going to speak in the next session itself. I think just to sum up what has happened so far, I don't want to take much time because we have just crossed the time that was allotted to us. 5 minutes to the little more than the scheduled one, but nothing to worry. We are absolutely going at a perfect pace, and thanks to all the speakers. I think Commodore Vasan started off his talk with summing up so far the efforts that have happened. He spoke largely on the financial burdens that are going to be, and the type of sanctions that's been imposed, and the type of work that has been done by India, including Operation Ganga and many other things. And it was well put across that how these complexities are going to get murkier, and the type of dynamics that are coming in every 2 hours. There is something that we are able to see. That's one side of the story that he brought in. And then we had the second speaker, that was Lieutenant General Chauhan. He brought in the perspective of a defense personnel, having worked very, very closely with the Russian military, and something that's at the ground level. He also brought in saying that that any country for that matter, when the national interest is troubled, how NATO has been threatening Russia, and of late it's become a normal story because nobody was greatly aware of who Zelensky is, and he was trying to use all his social media. He was trying to use all other possible ways to impress upon the world to give a different story altogether. So he gave a different perspective. And then we had Ram Madhav, who also spoke about many dimensions, asking about the nation states which have accepted rule-based world order, which have also accepted each one of them respecting each other's sovereignty. And how would that be if every other nation starts speaking about its national security and national interest and start attacking or march with the army? Will it end up becoming some sort of a survival of the fittest? Are we moving towards that direction? Or somewhere should diplomacy take over and stop all this type of things that are happening? He also expected or anticipated that India should be watching more carefully. India should look inwards and strengthen itself. Otherwise, we will end up being pawns in the hands of the Russians and the Chinese. These were some of the things that he brought incessantly. So my special thanks to all the eminent speakers and all of you there as part of the audience here. Excellent participation so far. So with this, we are closing our inaugural session, and we'll have a lot more in the question answer, many other things that we can do in the coming sessions. So over to you, Ms. Shri.
Thank you so much, sir, for enlightening us. It was an enthralling session indeed. I'm sure our viewers are all set to further their understanding of the issue with the upcoming session.